Welcome everyone to another episode of Revolution Recap. The Revs' unbeaten streak has sadly come to an end at 11 games as they fell 2-0 to LAFC Saturday night. Diego Rossi put LAFC out in front in the 8th minute with a cross-turned chip shot into the side netting, and Latif Blessing tallied an insurance goal in the 72nd minute as the Revolution offense struggled to find their footing in the final third. I'm Greg Johnstone. Joining me today is Seth Macomber from the Bent Musket. Seth, how's it going?
Yeah, happy to be here. A little disappointed that we aren't here with Larry Jackson, but happy to be here with you and Carl.
You know, we tried getting in touch with his people. It didn't work out. Maybe for a future podcast. You'll be the first to know when we get Larry Jackson to come on to talk Revs. But we did bring someone else back to the podcast, making his triumphant return. It's Carl Setterlund. Carl, how's it going?
Oh, I am thrilled to be back on the premier Revs podcast out there. Although I'd just like to note, I think you mispronounced Seth's name. He takes great offense to that. Macomber.
Macomber. You know what? I mispronounced everyone's name. I'm phonetically challenged. Anyone who's listened to this podcast knows I mispronounce names terribly, and I'll just blame Sean because I think he told me that was your.
Seth gets very mad when his name is mispronounced.
I'm sorry, Seth. That's my bad. You know, I'm surprised Seth just hasn't quit the podcast. No Larry Jackson mispronouncing his last name.
Is he still here? Did he hang up?
For the record, Carl is the one that's mispronouncing my name. But I'll answer to anything, really.
I'm just going to call you Sent from the Bent Musket from now on. Actually, so last week, the last podcast we did, there was someone who asked two questions, and I said his name twice, and I said it two different ways, and the first time it was correct, and the second way was not correct. And he's asked another question today, so we'll see if I remember which pronunciation is correct. Let's hop into the match. Let's go to our key takeaways of the match. Seth from the Bent Musket, what was your key takeaway from last night's loss?
Yeah, just tactically going into the game, the thing I was harping on is how the Revs would play their width. In recent weeks, we've seen Carlos Gil play on the right side, but then really come inside, play a very narrow midfield, which allows Brandon Bai to overlap to create the width. And that was really concerning to me because a lot of opponents have exploited that space in behind Brandon Bai, and sometimes on the left-hand side as well, but we don't see that quite as much with Pinilla out there because Pinilla does not play well in the middle. We could probably talk about that later on. He's better out wide, so you don't see as much overlapping happening on that side. You see it more on the right side. 8 minutes into the game, we see that LAFC take advantage of that space, and Rossi scores an opening goal. So it didn't take long for LAFC to actually create an opportunity and also capitalize by scoring. And we've seen in recent weeks other teams be able to exploit that space, but they just haven't been sharp enough to score. And versus LAFC, who play that 4-3-3, that played three in the front, at least in the beginning they were, there was going to be opportunities where they were going to be able to get in behind and create chaos, and they did that all throughout the night. They happened on the other side as well, with Vela getting in behind and going at Castillo. So that was a big tactical mismatch for me, and that created a lot of problems for the Revs. Even later on in the game, LAFC was getting their fullbacks up. So Beta Shore was getting up on the right-hand side. He had a good opportunity that he kind of flubbed. After the game, he talked about it was because of the turf. I don't any Revs fans ever heard that before, that fans don't like playing on the turf. He said on grass, he probably would have been able to get a shot off that maybe goes in the back of the net. But with the turf, his ankle kind of buckled a little bit. He wasn't going to get that shot off. And then, of course, on the other side, you have Jordan Harvey collecting the assist on the second goal. So those wide areas were a problem area for the Revolution all throughout the night. And it'll be interesting to see how they adjust next week when they face Seattle Sounders, who also can attack them on the width and have a lot of players that can exploit that space. So that's an area like going forward, Revs fans, definitely look out for that. Think about maybe some other adjustments that can happen. Do you try to sit back a little bit more with Brandon Bai? Do you try to play your midfielders a little bit wider? It's something that Bruce Arena and the Revs have to figure out if they're going to make the playoffs this year.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've been harping on for months now. The outside backs aren't the best defensively, and they seem to be two weak spots in the game. I think at one point yesterday, I saw Carlos Vela and Edgar Castillo one-on-one, and I was just thinking, boy, that's going to be exploited all night. The outside backs with the Revs are not the best in, I think, any of our opinions. So Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they kind of strengthen that area defensively when they face the tougher opponents, and it'll be interesting to see if there's any changes next week. I know that last night at the press conference, Bruce Arena said that Andrew Farrell, he doesn't know if he's a center back or a right back, but he needs him as a center back right now. So there doesn't seem to be any indication that Andrew Farrell is going to be moving back to right back. So Brandon Bai and Edgar Castillo look to be the two guys moving forward. Carl, do you have any key takeaways from last night's game?
Yeah, I guess I just feel like it's important to keep everything in context. It's been some major ups and downs this season, and they're just coming off a really big high of that unbeaten streak. But really have to keep that in the right perspective. And I know and deservedly, Bruce Arena was getting a lot of credit. And Mike Lapper too, if you want to include him. But you have to look at the games in the unbeaten streak, and just to go on for that long was impressive in its own right. But they're really the only good win in that stretch was over the LA Galaxy. That was Arena's first game, his former team. You can see how they would really get up for that game. There were a couple good draws in there against Philly. Again, that's a revenge game, so maybe a little extra motivation. And then the DC United ones. But overall, if you look back at that stretch, it was obviously a significant improvement over the Brad Friedel Revolution. I want to caution against people getting too ahead of themselves, that this is probably still a team that is going to be fighting for the seventh seed or maybe even the sixth seed, and more likely than not, it's not going to be a team that's going to make a deep postseason run or anything like that. You kind of saw against a quality team like LAFC, they held their own to a certain extent, but as Seth mentioned, they have that big weakness out wide, and you just saw a quality team is going to beat the Revs on, most days. A couple of those games, maybe the Revs can pull out if you have a special performance by a couple players or just different circumstances. But I just think, keep in mind that it was a good run, but, you've got the Sounders and the Red Bulls coming up, and you might not get any points from this 3-game stretch. You might get 1 or 2 points. You might get 3 points. 3 points is probably the best you can hope for. I really wouldn't expect them to win on the road against Seattle and New York. So keep things in context, I guess, is my message.
Yeah, and it's pretty hard to kind of go from an 11-game unbeaten streak and to kind of be knocked down to remember that this is a borderline playoff team, and they're going to be tested over the next few weeks at Seattle, like you said, Carl, and then at the New York Red Bulls on August 17th. I will say they have a couple of winnable games, 2 home games following that, Chicago and Toronto, but then they go back on the road, play New York City at Orlando. So the next 5 games, there are at least 3 that I would say it's fair to expect them to lose, or maybe you'd be happy with 1 point. And then there are 2 home games that maybe you take 6 points there. So 7 or 8 points from 5 games is not unrealistic. So it might be a bit of a tough month. We're going to go from a very high of highs to a bit of a, dare I say, summer slump. I'm going to actually not disagree, but I want to kind of touch on the offense for my key takeaway. Obviously, it was a bit of a lackluster performance after 10 goals in 3 games. Since the acquisition of Gustavo Bo. Getting shut out was kind of deflating, to say the least. I will say I think this team is still getting used to each other. Bo has been with the team roughly 3 weeks now. It seems like he's still not completely on the same page with everyone. They seem to be a little bit off here and there. And even with that, there were a couple of chances that were uncharacteristic for the Revs. I think the biggest chance that was missed was Brandon Bai kind of slides a pass to the center to a wide open Carles Gil, who just can't control it. The ball kind of slides off his foot and he doesn't get a shot off. If he controls that ball, I fully believe it was a 1-1 game at that point. Gustavo Bo, I think he had a play where Gil kind of leads him into the box and he whiffs on the shot. So they did have some kind of half chances that just never really fully developed. And I'm going to have my glass kind of half full in that, in a month from now, if they're a little bit on the same page, or if they don't have the bounces kind of go the wrong way, maybe they're able to put one in the net against LAFC. I do think that they weren't the better team. I do think that LAFC deserved all 3 points, but just the fact that the Revs came out and kind of at least fought to be in the game and fought to be in the same field as LAFC, I think is a promising sign, all things considered. And I think that if they do end up on the same page, I wouldn't be shocked if they beat New York in New York in 2 weeks. I wouldn't, bet on it. But I certainly think they're going to give some good teams a run for their money.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe to amend my previous point to really keep expectations low for the next couple games, is that they might run into some good luck if, as it appears, Aaron Long might be on his way to a transfer. Nothing for sure yet, but they might end up with some good fortune at the Red Bulls game, and sometimes you need that to get those extra points. And they have had some good fortune during the streak, and could continue in a couple weeks from now.
I just want to point out while you were talking that Seth left. I don't know if he's still upset about me mispronouncing his name. We'll try to get him back on. But yes, that is a good point about Aaron Long potentially leaving. And as I say, I think they've played the Rebels pretty close the last couple of weeks, or the last couple of times they've matched up. So we'll see how it goes. I want to get you guys' thoughts on Gustavo Bo. Seth, are you back with us?
Yeah, sorry, Carl was really boring me, so I wanted to leave for a minute.
They're very, very fair. I want to get your thoughts on Gustavo Bo, because this was probably his worst performance so far as a Revolution player. Overall, was not really effective, and for a guy that's playing in the center of the field, you're kind of hoping for a better game. Seth, I'll start with you. What were your thoughts on Gustavo Bo, and do you have any concerns about him going forward?
Yeah, so I thought it was kind of interesting. The Revs come out pretty hot, and then after LAFC scored the goal, it seemed like obviously momentum switched a little bit. It seems like the team started to change the way they were playing, where they were relying a little bit more on trying to get them on a fast break. Or what I was seeing a lot in the first half was a striker would check into the space and then try to get in behind, and they try to play a ball over the top. So sometimes that was Teal Bunbury doing that himself. He'd check in and then try to run into the space, or sometimes he would check in and you see Gustavo Bo try to run into that space. And in the second half, we saw that it was really trying to hit them on the counter, where Bo and Bunbury played really high, just basically as a 2, where everyone else would drop pretty far back. And then once they win the ball, they try to hit those players very quickly to try to create like a 2-on-2 or a 2-on-3 type situation. And there was some success there. I mean, we saw Teal Bunbury, turn his player, then go at him. I personally would have liked to see either an early ball into Gustavo Bo, or maybe Gustavo Bo hold his run a little bit so we could cut it back so Teal can cut it back, because Teal ends up shooting the ball and not even coming close to the mark. Because, generally speaking, we've seen that Bo's a better shooter than Teal Bunbury, which I don't think is saying too much in that regard. And after the game, Bruce Arena said the same thing, that he would have liked to have seen, Teal pass in that instance. I'm not really sure. I think we're still trying to figure out, the Revs are still trying to figure out where Gustavo Bo works best. I mean, we saw him in his first game play on the left-hand side. Then we saw him later on play on the right-hand side. Then we saw him in the middle. We've seen him up top at times. They're trying to figure out with this player. I do think that there is a little bit of concern, especially at a team like LAFC, where they're really exploring those wide areas. I am concerned about the idea of playing Carlos Gil out wide and then asking him to cut in, because I think you want him on the ball as much as possible. And if you're playing him out wide, you're going to lose the width because he's going to come inside. Or if you play him out wide, he's just not going to have as much touches on the ball. And I think the best moments last night were when he's on the ball trying to take on a player or two, then slip a pass. At one point there, he's coming in the middle, he's working hard, and then Gustavo Bo, you can see how clever he is with his runs. There was a few different times where he makes these clever, over the back shoulder of a defender type run, and he makes that run, and Carlos Gil slips him in behind, and ends up Gustavo Bo is offside, but he still misses a shot anyway. I think that's the type of partnership that you want to see. I think you want to see, Carlos Gil in the middle doing his defensive work. I think that's another thing that's underrated about Carlos Gil is how much work he puts in defensively, where if he's on the right-hand side, he's not doing that work in the middle as much, which is going to open up some gaps. And I think that you want him there. You also want him there for that creativity of moving the ball quickly, finding those gaps, trying to find those forward players. So I think that's one thing that you really got to keep in mind going forward. Because, this was like Bo's second game, where Bo's second game of his Revs career, he wasn't completely sharp. He wasn't really making those having the moments that he had in this first and third game. So I think that we're still, to your point, like you said earlier, Greg, I think that the Revs are still trying to figure out what the best formation is, what the combinations are going to be like. If they can get that going, then this attack is going to be one of the most dangerous, maybe not in the league, but like in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. You actually kind of took my next question of, do we need to move Carles Gil to the center of the field? Because I think that is I think he definitely works in the middle the best. I don't know where Gustavo Bo plays best right now. We're still kind of learning him inside and out, but I feel like Carles Gil not in the middle of the field is a big missed opportunity for the Revs, and they didn't seem to be clicking on all cylinders. So Gustavo Bo also, it should be noted that yesterday was his first game without a point. He had a goal in the first game, an assist in the second game against Cincinnati, and then a goal last week against Orlando. But of course that assist in Cincinnati was him kind of losing the ball and Carles Gil finishing his chance. So Carl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm ready to give up on Bo after that game. Not worth all the hype. I clearly saw a guy had a down game, and just done with him.
I mean, four games in, it's not going to get any better. There's no way.
I do think that, to you guys' point, I think there is a concern of, at least in my mind, Bruce Arena falling into the same trap that Jay Heaps did, where clearly there is a lot of good offensive personnel, and there is still some imbalance on this roster, where there are more good offensive players that you can fit into the lineup at one time, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but with Juan Agudelo in the center of the field, I would have preferred either, and I guess this is just swapping one offensive player for another, but maybe Heel in the center and put Diego in the lineup out on the wing, or even against LAFC, I thought Scott Caldwell could have fit in there and provided a little more balance in that group. I just worry. I think it's an interesting thing that Arena's doing, trying to find a way to fit Agudelo into this lineup, but also that he shouldn't force it, and especially shouldn't force it against a team like LAFC.
Yeah, and that's a good point, too. We actually did get a question about what changes, if any, would you make to the starting lineup? And I don't really blame Bruce Arena for going the way he did. He kind of played the hot hand, and it seemed like he was playing his quote-unquote best lineup. But, yeah, you wonder, Zahibo moved to the bench, and I know you said Scott Caldwell, but I'm surprised that, Bruce Arena seems to have a soft spot for Wilfred Zahibo and seems to like the Caicedo-Zahibo pairing, and he went with Juan Agudelo, which I thought was a bit interesting. I thought he would have gone with the pairing of Zahibo and Caicedo, which is a little bit more of a defensive-minded lineup, like you said, going against LAFC, who's going to really just torch you on the counterattack, and really on all phases of the game can torch you. So I was kind of surprised he didn't go with the more defensive lineup. Juan Agudelo, all things considered, didn't have a terrible game. He did have 12 ball recoveries, but I think that just is because LAFC held so much of the ball. He was 3 for 6 on tackles, 71% passing accuracy. He had an okay night, but he's a guy that's still learning that position. And yeah, I wouldn't call him a liability, but I think maybe more of a defensive pairing would have been better. That's really the only change I would have made to the lineup. Seth, do you have any thoughts on that? If maybe another defensive midfielder was the way to go as opposed to Juan Agudelo?
Yeah, it's a tough thing overall because I'm curious about this whole experiment, whether it be Agudelo or it's Diego Fagundes, because the games they played there have been okay, but I think both players aren't known for their defensive contributions. And what I mean by that is, sometimes they're out of position because they've never really been asked to play in that type of central role and track the players the way that they're supposed to be tracked. And sometimes they're out of position. Sometimes they're making tackles that aren't needed. For Agudelo, I was talking to Jason York of MLSoccer.com before the game, and I brought up that PK that could potentially be called a few games back. They're tussling in the box, and Agudelo pulls someone down. I think part of the reason why he has those instincts is because he's never really been in the box that often. Surely, like when he's on the outside, he comes back and he tries to win the header. So there are times he's there, but a lot of times throughout his career, he's been a center striker where he might be playing a little further up the field. Diego Fagundez, there was times where he's tackling someone outside the box and giving away a free kick in a bad area. So when you're a little bit further back, you have to be careful of when you push forward to make sure that there aren't gaps behind you if you quickly lose the ball or something. Or you have to be careful of when you're making certain tackles. And I think that that's something that, Agudelo could potentially learn. I think that what he does a nice job of is that he can make a quick move to create space for himself and then, find that next pass. And I think Diego and Agudelo are both good at that, where if you have Caicedo that's with you, covering a lot of that space, it cannot be overstated. I think I mention it every time I'm here, every time that I'm writing an article or on Twitter. Yeah, Caicedo covers so much ground. He is such a dynamic player, such a skillful player, such a player that just never gives up any moment. So he's going to cover you a lot of the times, but there's also times where you have to cover him. You have to make sure that you're also in a defensive block, especially against a team like LAFC, who are going to have so many attacking weapons go forward. Sometimes you have to fill those gaps in that back line. And if Agudelo is not always there, or he's not tracking a run in the midfield, there's going to be issues. So I think Agudelo, I was watching him really closely, and I was overall impressed by how often I was like, oh, that's a good tackle by him, or that's a good win by him, or that's a good, he gets the ball and moves it quickly. But there's other times where, he doesn't track a run. He's a little lackluster on his defensive marking at a moment. And I think the problem with the middle is that it only takes one or two of those bad moments to make you forget about the rest of a pretty decent game. And I think that when you're up top or you're on the wing, it's the opposite. You can have a bad game and all of a sudden you have one shot on goal, or you have one goal, you have one assist, and everyone's like, wow, that was a really great game. I was mentioning this about Christian Pinilla. Christian Pinilla was asked to come inside a lot and play a lot of defense, and it's just not his game. At one point, he's in the middle of the field, he loses the ball, and LAFC marched towards the goal, and they would have scored if it wasn't for Andrew Farrell making that goal line clearance. And it just happened time and time again, where that's just not Christian Pinilla's game. So I thought he had a pretty poor game, but all of a sudden later on, he has this shot that, just goes wide of the net. Like if it goes in the back of the net, everyone's kind of forgetting about all the other missed passes and poor tackles that happen. So Agudelo has to get in this mindset that it's a 90-minute or whatever it is performance. And I think that maybe he gets there. I'm not as confident as other people that he becomes like a true number 8 in this league. And I think that maybe against LAFC, who's a little bit more talented, maybe you go with someone who's played that number 8 spot for a longer time and knows all those responsibilities. But I'm more encouraged than I thought I would be when I first heard that Juan Agudelo is going to play the number 8. I'm still not there to think that this is going to be. I know there's some people saying that this could be his route back to the national team, and how people love to jump on the hot takes and stuff. I'm definitely not there yet. And I still think that probably in the offseason we see a defensive midfielder be brought in to pair with Luis Caicedo.
Yeah, I think Juan Agudelo on the national team, that ship has sailed by a couple of years now. But regardless, you're right. I think that there were a couple of moments too. I don't have the exact minutes or who was responsible, but I think it was around the 25th minute. Edgar Castillo, I think, is passing back and forth with Pinilla. and they turn it over, and Carlos Vela, I think it was like a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1, but it was a little slow to develop, so they didn't get a good shot off, and the emergency defending kicked in. And then there was another play which led to the Farrell saving his own goal off the line, where it might have been Juan Agudelo. Someone turns the ball over in midfield. It's a quick through ball to Vela, who's in on goal, and Turner comes out, makes the save, and then Farrell knocks it back. So there were 2 turnovers in the midfield or in the defensive third that really could have been disastrous for the Revs, that I think we'd be leading off the show with and talking about how poor the possession in the midfield was. And yeah, I think Juan Agudelo, again, nothing really you can point to as being totally disastrous, but I think it's very fair to say that he is a work in progress at best. So maybe he will develop, but you're right, Seth. I think as Carl said earlier, you can play Juan Agudelo in the midfield against FC Cincinnati, but come the playoff time, is Juan Agudelo going to be the best choice against the Red Bulls on the road? Is he going to be the best choice against NYCFC on the road? One other player I think we should talk about. We've mentioned him on and off, but Teal Bunbury, I think, is back in the ire of a lot of Revs fans. I think I made a comment yesterday that anti-Teal Revs Twitter is going to be something else after this game. It was a bit of a mixed performance from my view. Teal was only dispossessed once in the game. He had 7 ball recoveries, 74% passing accuracy, which is pretty good for a striker. He was 10 for 13 in the attacking third and 3 for 3 in the box. So there were some positives to come from Teal Bunbury's game. I want to get your take from it. Carl, it's been 3 games since Teal Bunbury has scored. His hot streak seems to be over. If there's someone that might be dropped from the starting lineup, do you think it's Teal Bunbury, or do you think he's safe for the time being?
I just want to point out that that was a pretty impressive monologue by Seth before, and if we wanted to log off, I think he could just handle the rest of the podcast himself and just a little solo, just talk for like a half hour straight.
Carl, if you don't mind, I'll take this question first, and you can answer anything else I don't cover.
Hold on. I think with Teal Bunbury, you just got to stay realistic. There are frustrating moments, and I obviously understand to see him. I don't know how wide he was on that breakaway counterattack. Was at least 5 feet wide of goal. I think he didn't even get it close to the target, and so that in the moment you say, "Wow, that's the center forward, huh?" But you just got to think that there's the whole package with Teal Bunbury. And you're getting other things that offset. Obviously, it's not ideal to have your center forwards not be able to hit the target, but he does a lot of other good things. He takes a lot of pressure off of the other guys around him just by his work rate and energy, and puts them in slightly better positions. Takes a little bit of the onus off of them to put in maybe they can save their legs a little bit because Teal's willing to do that extra work. And when you have a lineup that has so many guys around him capable of scoring, then I think you can afford to have a guy like Teal in that position. And as you were saying, Greg, the hot streak's over. He's a very hot and cold player. I think maybe Bruce Arena taking over was a bit of an inspiration. Teal's a very competitive guy, and maybe that pushed him that impetus of wanting to impress the new coach. This is your chance to lock down the starting job with the new coach, and that might have not that he's letting off the gas pedal now, but just it's tough to keep that up throughout the whole season. And I think you did see that last season where maybe relied a little too much on Teal, and by the end of the season he was running out of gas just to play that type of role for a full season. And so I actually think it might be to its benefit not to be this starter week in, week out, to have a little bit of rotation in there, and have a few games where I'm not advocating that he's never in the starting lineup, that JF Caicedo takes over the role completely, but I think a little bit of rotation where Teal maybe doesn't play, maybe he comes off the bench for 20 minutes or something, can refresh him a little bit, and then push that competitive streak a little bit, that when he gets out there he wants to score again so that he can get back into the starting lineup. So I almost think it might be good to rotate him out. Not necessarily just because he wasn't able to convert that maybe the best chance the Revs had against LAFC, but that it could just be the best thing for the team overall.
Seth, you have any thoughts to tack onto that?
It's just hard because Teal Bunbury works so hard, and I think that's an important part of the pressing style that's gone away a little bit, but there's still an element of we want to win the ball higher up the field, or at least start our defensive efforts from our strikers. And you saw that at times that LAFC get the ball in their back line, and Teal Bunbury just comes running, or he makes a curved run to try to keep the ball on one side of the field. But we saw a hot streak, and we know that Teal Bunbury is good for a hot streak at some point. That's just what he's done throughout his career. But there was going to be a time that he cooled, and now he's cooled. He had to at least gotten that shot on goal. And if he's not going to get the shot on goal, then he needs to find a way to move the ball to Bo and to have Bo get a shot on goal. I don't know if this game would have been any better with Juan Caicedo up top. I do think there's times that he should be up top because he can hold the ball up a little bit better, and I think that he can create with all those attacking elements around him. So you can imagine a hold-up striker where the ball gets to him, and then it gets played to Carlos Gil, who then moves it quickly for Bo, who's running in behind. And I think at times Teal Bunbury's touch just isn't quite there enough, where that he's not going to bring it down clearly, then move it very quickly, where Caicedo, who we mentioned multiple times that I totally recognize there are a lot of qualities that are not great about Caicedo, but he is definitely the type of player that has the instincts to play the number 9, to bring the ball down, to move it quickly, to play the back heels, to try to go in for that tap-in type of moment. So I think that we will probably see him at times, but I don't know. It's hard to imagine, especially where the strategy was, let's try to get in behind the LAFC back line. Caicedo's not going to do that. He's not fast enough. So you put a guy like Bunbury who is quick. You put a guy like Bo, who's not necessarily the quickest guy out there, but he's crafty enough to time his run to try to get in behind. So given the strategy, those are probably the guys that you put on the field. But yeah, pretty lackluster night from the strikers.
Yeah, and I don't want to hop on the Teal needs to be benched because he's gone 3 games without a goal train just yet, but I certainly see the frustrations from the people who are never on the Teal Bunbury train. I will say I think Teal adds kind of a defensive and work rate kind of addition to his game that we don't get from, say, Christian Pinilla. So I do think there's some added value where you can move him to the wing if you're trying to protect a lead or something like that. I'm curious to see what they do with him going forward. It seems like Bruce Arena likes him. I don't think he will sit out against Seattle. I think they'll give him at least another game just to see if he can find the back of the net. But it wouldn't shock me if eventually, try in an attempt to figure out where Gustavo Bo plays best, maybe they move Gustavo Bo up top, move Gil to the center, and move Teal back to right wing where he's played before. I know he played there earlier this year with mixed results, but I don't know. I can't see him moving to the bench full time. But
where's Brian Wright when you need him? A finisher,
best finisher on the team. Yep.
Maybe time to recall him from Birmingham.
That is true. Brian Wright would have finished that shot that Bunbury had yesterday. So
it's worth noting that the Revs have lost every game since Justin Rennicks has went on loan. So
that's true. I got nothing to add to that. Let's move on to listener questions for the time being. Zach Grimes asks us, looping forward to next week's game, should we make any changes or should we keep going with the same formation that has been proven to be solid in the 11-game unbeaten streak? Carl, I'll start with you. I don't think, let me add my thoughts first. I don't think there'll be any changes to the formation. I think they'll play kind of the same shape. But there'll be a new center back in there because De La May, it sounds like, will be out for a little bit. It sounds like my guess would be Annie Baba and not Mancien in the starting lineup. And then I think we'll see Zahibo over Agadello. Carl, I'll lead with you if you want to tell me that Scott Caldwell is going to start, but go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think the same shape and formation roughly with maybe some new personnel. I think Annie Baba, to me, makes more sense, but Arena was mentioning Mancien in the post-game press conference. I hesitate to throw him to the wolves against a strong team like that when he's been out for so long. But so I personally, I would say Annie Baba next week because it does look like Delamea is going to be out. And then maybe you get a little bit of rotation elsewhere in the lineup. Maybe throw in Diego or JF Caicedo or someone. It looks like also that Luis Caicedo might be out, so then you have to fill that spot as well. But generally, I don't think they changed the formation. I think they maybe changed some of the players.
Yep, no, I agree with everything you said there. I think they and you mentioned Luis Caicedo's potential injury too. That's worth noting that there might be some shifts there. But moving on to C Money 008 from Discord, he asks us, how do the Revs bounce back against a very good Seattle team on the road after a lackluster performance tonight? Seth, any thoughts on what the Revs can do to bounce back in Seattle?
C Money was me, so I was.
Are you actually C Money?
Yeah, that's C Money's me. No, I'm not on Discord. I'm not on Discord at all. So
you had me fooled. I'm going to say it's Larry Jackson.
So after the game, Bruce Arena was asked about this, and he was pretty quick and kind of said the boys will be fine. But they're going to be fine. They're going to recover from this loss pretty quickly. We'll go back to the training ground and we'll prep for next week's game. It's going to be a tall ask. There's no question. I mean, if the defense is going to play the way they did against LAFC and the offense is going to play the way they did against LAFC, I mean, we could be looking at a second consecutive loss. To me, it's just stuff that we talked about earlier. Like, how are you going to play in the wide areas? How are you going to try to combine the attacking third? Again, I would try to get Carlos Gil back in the middle, and I'd probably actually go with Carlos Gil in the middle, Teal Bunbury on the right hand side, Gustavo Bo on the left hand side, and Caicedo up top. And that's what we saw in the first game when they were all together. So I'd probably go with that type of lineup and then bring Christian Pinilla on late to see if he can run at guys and try to create things that way. And it gives you some speed in the flank. It gives you a couple guys that you know can play some pretty good defense, and that will help provide cover for Castillo and Brandon Bai when they go forward. So it's a tough ask. There's no question about it, but all you can do at this point is get back on the training ground. I mean, the positive thing here is after a 11-game unbeaten run, spirits are still relatively high. You know, like it's not a situation where you lose one, you win one, you lose three, you win two, and it's just that, you know, up and down, up and down. I mean, at this point, spirits are pretty high. They probably weren't expecting to be in this position given the beginning of the year. So, you know, the guys continue to keep this momentum going, continue to keep things light, continue to have good training sessions. I think it's interesting to note that after the game, Bruce Arena does mention that everything he's doing this year is prepping for next year. So there's an understanding that this year is a bonus. I mean, when you're 2-8-2 to start the year, to even get in the playoffs is a big accomplishment. So as long as the team continues to build and continues to recognize themselves and continue to build these partnerships and identify areas of weaknesses, then this year is going to be fine. And we're all kind of looking more towards 2020 as a year that, like, Bruce Arena gets to put his stamp firmly on this team.
So although I'm not C Money, that question was actually what I asked Arena at the press conference and what Seth was referencing. That
that makes a lot more sense to me, by the way. I get what you were saying now.
There's a thing that it's not really related to this topic of whether they'll bounce back, but there's been a phenomenon that has come with the Bruce Arena era where you ask what is generally an open-ended kind of question that you're expecting as a reporter, a couple sentences response you can use for a quote, and Bruce Arena just says they'll be fine. And from our perspective, writing stories, mine will probably come out on Monday night or Tuesday. It's frustrating because you're looking for a quote from Bruce Arena, but you can also see that from the player's perspective, and I don't know if any of them even watched the press conference, but you just see his confidence and his mannerisms that he's not making a big deal out of this LAFC loss. He's not going to play mental games with them. He's feeling still pretty confident and pretty calm about where they are, and he mentioned that they have good leadership, and he's not doesn't really have any concern about this loss really throwing them off of their overall form. So it's interesting as a reporter that it can be difficult to get the other question I asked in the press conference. Bruce Arena's response was, I think you just answered your own question and then moved on. So it can be frustrating from that perspective, but you can also see where this is a style that is leading to a good team culture and a confidence in themselves and a comfort with the overall group and the coaching staff and everything that they clearly didn't have under Brad Friedel just a few months ago.
Yeah, it seems to be the opposite of Revs fans after that LAFC game, where he's very calm and collected, not completely concerned, where I think a lot of people had the sky is falling mentality. This is going to lead to a worse run. But Bruce Arena seems to be pretty poised and seems pretty confident in this team going forward. Let's move on. Carl, I'm coming to you with this next question. Randy LH asks us on Twitter. It seems the narrative has been that all we need is a solid defensive signing and we'll be contenders. Given our offensive struggles to finish in this game, does that narrative change? What are your thoughts on transfer window is closing very soon? Do you think the Revs, first off, do you think they still need a defensive signing? Or do you think that maybe they might be looking for someone on the offensive side of the ball following last night's game?
Yeah. Well, what Seth mentioned also that Bruce Arena said keeps reiterating that he's taking a longer-term approach, and which I think is good in the sense that you've seen in years past with Mancien, with Christian Nemeth, with the other signings that it doesn't. It's better to wait until the off season, maybe, and when you can really pick your player and target the guy who's the right fit for what you think your needs are as a team, rather than overpaying for a guy who might not be a perfect fit, but kind of you could see how they could improve your team. So I think that it seems that there's nobody really on the cusp that Bruce Arena and the staff have singled out that they want to add before the end of this window, and so I think it makes sense to wait rather than to just kind of take whatever opportunity pops up, just in terms of a long-term roster building approach. That there is a ceiling to this team, probably, that you can catch lightning in a bottle, but I don't think necessarily adding one good defensive piece is going to get them over the hump against NYCFC or Atlanta United or stuff like that. I think it's probably, you're looking at a 1 to 2 year build to get to the point where maybe you're a real legitimate contender. I do still think defense is, or even defensive midfielder or someone to pair with Luis Caicedo is probably the top priority. Offense, you got to figure out where everything fits in, but I think they have plenty of talent up there, and they've shown previously that they can. This group can score. It might just be a matter of getting the pieces in the right place and developing the chemistry. But they have plenty of upside on the offensive end. Defensively, I think that's probably you can pick your your poison, and part of it probably depends on whether you think Andrew Farrell can be a starter at center back, or you want to move him back out to right back. I think I would probably target a nice, sturdy, dependable center back. Unfortunately, it seemed Antonio Delamea was maybe on the comeback trail and was regaining the form that he hasn't had for a couple years, and that was going to be a feel-good story. Now he gets injured again, and so we'll see how long that recovery takes. And Mancienne, I think, similarly, you struggle to put too much. You just can't rely on Delamere or Mancienne to be healthy for a full season. Be good to have them as, or at least one of them as a potentially high upside, backup with, or have both of them and hope one of them stays healthy to pair with another strong center back. Because I also I think Annie Baba's a good backup, but ideally not your starter, especially if you don't have very defensive minded, dynamic fullbacks, which Castillo obviously is much more of an offensive player. Farrell, for his strengths and weaknesses overall, I think is at least a league average right back. So I think you're probably set there if he ends up shifting back there. So definitely the defensive side is where they need to add, but I don't think it's going to be in this window.
Carl, let me do a quick follow-up with you there, too. Michael Mancienne, we talked about, he made his way back into the 18. We might see him over Annie Baba next week. Do you expect anything from Michael Mancienne coming back from injury, or do you, is there any expectations that he might regain his spot as a starter on this team, or do you have zero expectations, he's just going to kind of be around and leave after the season?
I do think if they take the patient approach with him, that there might be a chance that I think you've got to shoot for having him back to 100% by playoff time and not push him to get back too early, because over his time with the Revs, he has been a little injury prone, and so you've got to kind of take a careful approach with that. So I caution. I think it's great that he's back in the 18, but I don't think that necessarily means he should be back in the XI next weekend against Seattle. So I do think there is some upside there, especially if you consider that when we were most of us who watched the Revs games earlier in the season were saying Michael Mancienne doesn't look too hot out there. I mean, there's plenty of plays where it looked like he didn't step up to stop an offensive chance, and part of that might have just been that he was really injured, playing through a real injury, and so I think there is potential that he's still a good MLS center back if he's at least 90%.
Yeah, it kind of puts his performance at the beginning of the season in a different light, because I know he left the Dallas game before it started with an injury, and he played in Philadelphia on painkillers. I agree with your assessment that if this team is going to go into the playoffs, you're going to need all hands on deck defensively, and so you're going to want a Michael Mancienne at 100%. So I think it's great that they're kind of bringing him back in slowly, but I don't know, with the emergence of Delamea, I think Arita trusts Farrell at center back, so I don't think he's moving Farrell. I wonder if they, are just kind of keeping Mancienne kind of in the background, and he might make a spot start here or there, or if he comes back and kind of is the anchor center back that he was supposed to be. I could see a wide range of results from Michael Mancienne in the closing months of the season, but it'll be interesting to see if he starts over Annie Baba next week, because I could absolutely see it, but I also think that, as you said, they're being extremely cautious with them coming back. So very good chance that Michael Mancienne does not play for the Revs again. So will be interesting to see. Seth, hopping back over to you. Mike Kennedy asked us, my eye test said Heel and Bo had stinkers. Was it a bad game from our DPs, or were they effectively marked out by LA's three midfielders who clogged up the passing lanes?
Yeah, I think it was just a tough game where I think the Revs, especially as the game went on, were more defensive and they were playing back quite a bit. It was difficult for them to do their passing game that we've seen in recent weeks. I mean, in recent weeks, we saw that, Heel gets on the ball, he combines with someone else, he gets someone in behind, and they score a goal that way. I think that you're talking about a team that has an opponent that has a lot of big stars, that is well coached. I mean, Bob Bradley is a very, very good coach. Bruce Arena is a very good coach, but Bob Bradley is a very, very good coach, where he's going to know how to set up his team properly to make sure that those types of players aren't getting on the ball as often. I do think that one thing that LAFC did really well is that they swarmed players, where you have to move the ball very quickly, because they had 2-3 players quickly closing down someone and making sure that they didn't have the opportunity to take too many touches. So, I mean, it's something to continue to watch going forward. I brought this up online just before. I went back, and everyone's talking about this idea that Carlos Gil, we talked about in the last podcast, Carlos Gil should have been on the All-Star team. And I don't disagree with it. I mean, he's a very good player. The All-Star game and how they make their rosters is kind of an interesting thing anyway. But if you go back, when the All-Star team was announced in late June, Carlos Gil only had 4 goals and 4 assists. He's only come on and been very, very hot recently. And I do think, like we talked about in the last podcast, part of that has to do with the way the team was set up under Bruce Arena, and now there's much more passing that's going on. There's much more creativity that's happening. So, I think that we need to continue to watch how these players combine with each other, especially against better opponents, where, again, I do really believe Carlos Gil is an elite player in this league. There's no question about it. But when you look back, he's scoring a lot of goals and making a lot of things happen with teams that aren't in the playoffs, teams that are going through rough patches. So it'll be interesting to see against teams that are set up organizationally very well, that have these, real stars. How do the attacking players in the Revs find their spaces? Because, I mean, if you look back at the Orlando game, I have zero understanding of how they're playing defensively. It made no sense what they were doing. They were leaving gaps in behind. They were not closing down players. I mean, if you look at Diego Fagundes' goal, is an Orlando player ever going to step up there? Or if you look at if you look at Gustavo's Bow goal against Orlando City, literally all he does is he passes, he has a back heel to Castillo. 3 Orlando players stare at Castillo, and Gustavo Bow runs around their back and then scores the goal. It's just confusing stuff that some opponents are doing, that if that happens in LAFC, Bruce Arena and Bob Bradley, you would imagine, just goes absolutely nuts. And he's like, what are you guys doing? 3 players staring at Edgar Castillo? What is Edgar Castillo going to do to you versus the DP that just came in? Or you're not going to shut down Diego Fagundes when he's marching towards goal. So a team like LAFC is going to be better organized. They're going to know when to press, when not to press. They're going to be aware of the attacking players on the field. So, yeah, definitely something to take a look at and think about in the games to come.
Yeah, we'll learn a lot about this team against the tougher schedule coming up in August. Moving back over to Carl, Muhammad Hussein asks us, do you think we should move Gustavo Bow to striker and Gil to central attacking mid, which is kind of what I suggested earlier, and bring on, he also suggests bringing on Christian Pinilla and Diego Fagundes as super subs. We also did get another comment from Flo on Discord, not Flo from Progressive. Is Pinilla just a super sub? So, Carl, this is a bit of a 2-part question. What do you think about Bow to striker, Gil to central attacking midfield, and then Christian Pinilla potentially as a super sub?
Ideally, I think that Pinilla is probably best utilized as a starter when LAFC wasn't his best game, but he has that ability to be really dynamic and more than just what you're looking for off the bench. I think he has shown over the past year and a half that he is a player that should be an MLS starter. So I don't think that I don't necessarily love the idea of looking at him as like your super sub that you're looking to change the game off the bench. They have other players who can kind of fit that role. As for the where to put Bo and Heel, I do really prefer Heel in a central role. I think Bo is still up for debate where his best position is, and it's hard to none of us really watched much apart from maybe a highlight reel on YouTube or something before he came to the Revs. So it's still very early days in terms of getting a handle on where exactly Bo fits best into this lineup with this group of players. I would, I know this might not be the most popular idea and that plenty of people will disagree with me, but I personally can see the wisdom in maybe putting Heel in that number 8 role a little bit further back, given that we've seen how high his work rate is, how he's actually, how Seth was mentioning that players like Diego and Agudelo, they have been in such attacking roles for so long that they haven't really developed, or maybe their defensive skills that far back in the field aren't quite what you're looking for in that position. But Heel, I think, can handle that. And I know some people would say that that's wasting his creative talents and his scoring talents, but I think maybe that's kind of the role that I always thought, maybe Kellen Rowe on his best day, that would have been where he'd fit into the lineup. But obviously Heel, a much higher work rate and a more skillful player. But I think he can impact the game a little further back in the field, as if you're not going to use Caldwell as that connector and distributor, that maybe Heel is that guy who can, orchestrate things and really set up the offensive players in the best positions, while also providing some cover in the middle of the field. So personally, I maybe would like to see similar lineup that the Revs went with against LAFC, but you could swap Heel back in where Agudelo was, and either I don't know. I think Heel could work there. Bo, I don't really have a strong opinion on where you put him yet.
Yeah, they're both players that there's multiple right answers and not many wrong answers on where to play them. And I don't think the idea of playing Carlos Heel back at the 8 position is necessarily a bad one. I mean, he's a very strong defender. He holds possessions very well. I'm not sure. I mean, if they continue to play Bo in the center, I wouldn't be opposed to maybe pairing him and Heel both in the center and kind of having some overlap. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of Carles Heel out wide, as we mentioned earlier. So, all very good points. I want to add another question here that I think we've already answered, so we won't get into it. But Heel is Dad from Discord asked us, what would you have changed tactically to break down LA? And Seth, I think he gave a very good answer on that earlier, so we won't rehash that one out. Chris Velukas asks us, is a Fabian Johnson acquisition too much to ask for, or can we get Kellen Rowe back from the USL to play left back? Serious questions. I want to tackle this one because we mentioned Fabian Johnson a few weeks ago. There was a Twitter rumor that the Revs were interested in Fabian Johnson, and Sean was on that week, and we kind of talked about how Fabian Johnson might be a better winger than a left back, and we talked about how it's probably not a great fit because of Fabian Johnson's history with Bruce Arena, and they had a bit of a falling out with the U.S. men's national team. And also, I want to point out that we've mentioned a few times that they're playing for next year. Everything they're looking at is long-term. I think Fabian Johnson would be a short-term fix, not necessarily a long one given his age and given his potential salary. I mean, if he's coming in on a DP contract, which he may or may not, I don't think the Revs want to lock in a third designated player in this window. It seems like they are going to keep that designated player spot open for an off-season acquisition when the time comes. So I think Fabian Johnson is not a great match for the Revs, all things considered. And Kellen Rowe, I cannot imagine him ever coming back to New England, not just because he's not a great fit for left back, but because of the comments he also made about New England and about how it was a graduation. So I don't think we'll ever see Kellen Rowe coming back to New England for a number of reasons. But with that being said, I would be more than happy if the Revs went out and got a left back, a defensive left back to kind of come in for Edgar Castillo if you're trying to hold a 1-0 lead. I think an outside back with a little bit more defensive skill is on the list, and I think there are a few around MLS that the Revs could go after that won't cost them a huge amount of assets. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Seth, we got a question here from Josh Nye of the Bent Musket. He asks us, do you think that Matt Turner lost his spot after last night's performance? So, Seth, the question is, Josh Nye, is he now a former Bent Musket writer for asking this? This is quite insulting and disrespectful. Seth, what are your thoughts on Josh's terrible question and Matt Turner's performance?
Yeah, we're much like this podcast is a pro Matt Turner podcast. The Bent Musket is a pro Matt Turner news source. I think you and I were the first ones that were tweeting about Matt Turner hype train. I think you were the one saying that to get on the train, and I was the one saying that he should be on the national team when he first emerged. Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Matt Turner. I mean, he had some great saves. The scoreline could have been much worse. I think there's two that stand out as the huge, athletic. Most other people don't make those types of saves, type moments. And I think I've mentioned this before. With goalkeepers, it's about consistent reps. And goalkeeping is a position where you can't bring this guy on in the 60th minute to get a little run out. Like, you're either the starter or you're not the starter. And Cody Cropper had a full season as a starter. He wasn't the player. You guys have mentioned some really great stats about his expected, how many goals he lets in and how that compared to the rest of the league. So I won't go through and look at those again. But he just wasn't the starter. He wasn't good enough. And granted, the team wasn't great that year. But you can look back at the last 2 years and say the defense hasn't been that great either. And in that situation, Matt Turner has stepped up, and he has made some huge stops that either gain the Revs some points or prevent the scoreline from being more embarrassing. And I think Brad Knight is who he is. He's a solid backup. He's a good veteran presence. He's a guy who steps in for a couple games and does the job. So I can't imagine putting anyone else in that position and put anyone else in that position and getting better results. So you keep Matt Turner in there. I don't think he had that bad of a game overall last night by any means. But even if he did have a bad game, I'd say, no, it's his for the rest of the season. You ride it out. And then at the end of the season, if Bruce Arena decides that he doesn't like Matt Turner, then you can go out and get another goalkeeper. But give him the entire season to continue to grow and to have that spot be his own.
Did Seth just steal my Matt Turner take? I feel like I got take stolen there. So I believe I was the one last year who asked whether Matt Turner should be considered for the national team, or was that just Brad Friedel mentioning that out of the blue?
Could have been all of us. I mean, look, I think it's fair to say that we all love Matt Turner. This is a pro Matt Turner podcast. That's specifically why I brought you guys on. It's because, I vet your opinions on Matt Turner.
I know you guys saw my SBI soccer piece last week that looked at Matt Turner's save percentage during the unbeaten streak, which was like 81% or something like that. And which would be by far the MLS record if he could do it over a whole season. Obviously, you can't just take the player's best stretch of the season and say they would have the best season in MLS history. That's only a small sample size. But Matt Turner has been great in the past couple months, and I don't think he was even bad against LAFC. I think he was fine. So Seth, maybe have a little talk with that Bent Musket contributor.
I'm really happy to know that it does not reflect the opinions and the values of the Bent Musket organization. And for all I know, I think Josh might be trolling just to get a response, which he did. Good for Josh. But I do want to just point out that Matt Turner is now 4th in MLS in goals against to expected goals against differential. I've had difficulty explaining this before, but basically by this metric, he's the 4th best keeper behind Steve Clark of Portland, Daniel Vega of San Jose, and Bill Hamid of DC United. And he has significantly less minutes than the rest of them, except for Steve Clark. Steve Clark has 988 to Turner's 832. So, Matt Turner, if you want to go off of statistics, and this is according to American Soccer Analysis, has been one of the best keepers in MLS this season. So, and getting back to last night too, he had a couple of really nice plays. LAFC had 20 chances yesterday, and the Revs conceded twice. And I don't necessarily think the defense was that great, but there were a couple play where Carlos Vela, obviously the Farrell own goal, near own goal, Turner came out nicely and charged that one and made the stop. There were a couple play where Vela kind of had Turner one-on-one, and Turner was able to cut off the angle and really frustrate Vela. I think one time he tried chipping it across the box, and it was cleared up by either Farrell or By, and then he also had a shot that went wide that Turner did a nice job of forcing the shot wide. So Turner had some, and then of course there were 3 or 4 good saves from Matt Turner. So I thought Matt Turner played pretty well, and I think if you have a Cody Cropper or a Brad Knighton, I think that scoreline is a little bit higher than 2-0. So we do not appreciate the question, Josh. How dare you? Seth, any other final thoughts there?
Carl, there's this thing called Twitter, so I went back and looked at it. I don't know if you remember this question from 5/30/2018, but the tweet you wrote says, by the way, Friedel brought up that Matt Turner could be on the U.S. men's national team on his own. The question by @SethMan31, which I believe is my Twitter account, very professional name right there. The question by SethMan31 was simply, what is his potential? So it seems like I was the one to first mention Matt Turner's potential and how high it could be, which led to the infamous question, the answer by Friedel saying that he could someday be on the U.S. men's national team. So I'm just saying, quick fact checked about what you just said right there.
Actually, SethMan is my Twitter handle, and I was referring to myself in that, my alternate Twitter handle in that tweet right there.
Fair enough, C-Money. Fair enough, C-Money.
Moving on, Bo is the GOAT from Discord asks us, well, this is another troll question, I think, but how many games do we lose in a row before we get eliminated from playoff contention? I say 0. I think we're winning next week at Seattle, so we'll just move on to the second question. But Carl, the more serious question here, is it realistic to say that we can still make the playoffs easily looking at our impossible Seattle, Portland, Red Bulls, NYCFC, and Atlanta schedule? Those are 5 games, I think, of the remaining 10, and 6 of the remaining 10 games are on the road. So, Carl, how do you feel about the Revs' playoff chances?
I think that they're definitely in the mix, but they are going to be fighting. They're going to be in a dogfight with Toronto, possibly with Montreal as well, and the schedule is definitely not friendly. You mentioned that they're on the road a lot. They've really got to maximize their home games. Chicago, I think they can't settle for 1 point in that upcoming home game later this month. The TFC game also next month at home. That might be an even more important game than the LAFC game was really a culmination of the unbeaten streak and led to a lot of excitement about that. But the TFC game at the end of August might be the most important game left on the schedule because they really need as many points as they can get. I think they are definitely stuck in that between the 6 to 8 range in the East. Possibly if they go on a run, maybe they can still get up to the 5th seed or something like that. But you look at the schedule and it is very tough. Not just these upcoming ones against on the road against the Sounders and the Red Bulls. And NYCFC twice. They've still got Atlanta left on the schedule. Portland. Maybe the last two games are against NYCFC and Atlanta, and I guess there's a potential that they've already locked up their seedings and they want to keep guys healthy for the playoffs, and maybe that scenario could play to the Revs' benefit if they're in a tight race with Toronto or Montreal. I think probably Orlando's dropped out of that playoff mix. But it's going to be tough. It's going to be, and you can kind of see why Bruce Arena has tempered expectations and hasn't really taken the bait anytime someone asks him about how great the team's playing and coming back and maybe making the playoffs this year. He hasn't really gotten too carried away, and that might be because he looked at the schedule and said to himself, "It's going to be tough." So they're in the mix, but it's not a sure thing. Definitely.
Yeah, I think 538 had their playoff odds around 58% last week. I haven't looked it up to see if it's been updated today. I imagine it'll be a 50-50 shot. Just some other listener comments that we want to wrap up with. Patrick Delaney says, we can't be too disappointed we lost, but I think we should have scored once. 11 games is a really good streak, and we should still be proud of the boys. Agreed there. Mike D on Twitter also says, I think the early goal set the tone for the game. LA was able to take their foot off the gas, play defense, and wait for our mistakes. The better team won, but this game could be a good building block for Arena to use for the rest of the season. And that actually is a good point that we haven't talked about today. I think Matt Doyle had the stat that prior to this LAFC game, since Brad Friedel was fired, the Revs were trailing for a grand total of 28 minutes in only one game. So this was a bit of a different game from what we've seen throughout the unbeaten streak, where the Revs were playing from behind and on their back foot the entire game, and LAFC, who's the superior team, as he says, was able to just kind of lock down defensively and try to counterattack and wait for mistakes in the midfield. So
that was Matt Doyle who had that stat. It was not Seth.
What did I say? Did I say Zach Doyle?
No, Matt Doyle beat me by 25 seconds.
Oh, yes.
We both drew the same thing.
No. Yeah, that's why I did not credit Seth. We can't give Seth credit for everything. He tries to take credit for the Matt Turner stuff. No. And then also Powder Hungry on Twitter says Zahibo is passing like he changed the FIFA passing assist to manual. Scratch that. The whole team passed like trash. We didn't complain about Wilfred Zahibo, but if you go back to that second goal, by the way, Seth, I know we've complained about Zahibo not tracking back on certain plays. That play is not very different. Looks like De La Mea steps up. Zahibo starts to chase back and then realizes he's not going to get there and just kind of gives up on the play. So a little bit more of the same from Big Z. Some other just quick news worth noting. We've already talked about Luis Caicedo and De La Mea leaving with injuries. It sounds like De La Mea is out for next week. Luis Caicedo is still not known. Justin Rennicks and Isaac Anking were loaned out to, I believe it was North Carolina and Charlotte, respectively. So those two guys are getting some minutes, which I think everyone on here today certainly agrees with it. If the young guys are not getting minutes, it's good to send them down to get minutes elsewhere. So hopefully those guys get to develop a little bit in USL. And then before we go to our final thoughts, we do have to kind of briefly mention that yesterday was the return of Lee Nguyen to Foxborough. He entered in the somewhere around the 80th minute. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but at the time the Revs were down 2-0, so I think the crowd was less than enthusiastic, and the only ones that seemed to really care at that point that Lee Nguyen was coming in were the fans that were booing him. Bit of an interesting reception yesterday for Lee Nguyen. Carl, I saw you kind of in the weeds on Twitter about Lee Nguyen, so you seem to be the one most passionate about this. What are your thoughts about fans booing Lee Nguyen in his return to New England?
You're correct. This is something that I do have a bit of a passion for. I thought it was wrong. I thought it was a bad look by the fan base. I realize it doesn't reflect everyone, and it might have been. There are a lot of more casual fans that were there, and it seemed that Lee did get a positive reception from the supporters section, from the the Midnight Riders, the Rebellion, and some others that were down toward the field. You saw some videos on social. You saw him going over to that side of the field afterward, and he said that was a positive reception from them and that he appreciated it. but you couldn't ignore that it was a pretty decent decibel level of booing when he came onto the field, and I don't think he deserves that. I mean, Lee Nguyen has, from I think our experiences interacting with him, can say that he generally is a good guy. He's not a head case or a troublemaker that tried to disrupt the Revs. He gave them several good years. The one time he did have a contender level team around him, Jermaine Jones gets a lot of the credit too, but he had the MV Lee season where they went to the MLS Cup and lost against one of the better teams in MLS history. Obviously, Bruce Arena's LA Galaxy, which had Keane, Donovan, Yassi Zardes, Omar Gonzalez. That was a juggernaut team, so it wasn't too surprising that they lost that game. But it was pretty clear that Lee Nguyen wasn't going to have a chance to compete for a title as the Revs were previously constructed before Bruce Arena came in. I think that Lee Nguyen has been one of the players in U.S. history that has gotten kind of screwed the most in terms of he's always been underpaid. He's putting up huge seasons and has never been a DP or even, I think, at the max salary. Never really got a fair look at the U.S. men's national team. He's had a tough road, and over that time, he's been a pretty nice guy about these situations. But it came to a point where they weren't willing to pay him what he deserved, and they also weren't willing to put a team around him that was going to compete for a title. And Lee Nguyen is coming toward the tail end of his career, and it made sense that he would want to go someplace else. I also want to point out that the holdout was only really because the Revs weren't willing to meet him halfway, and they probably could have even gotten a better package in return if they had been willing when Lee had asked for a trade. And reportedly from Brian O'Connell, he even asked for a trade the previous season before that, and then he came out and whatever it was, 11 goals and 18 assists or something like that. I forget the exact numbers, but he had a fantastic season after reportedly asking for a trade that offseason. Gave it 100% that year, asked for a trade again, still wouldn't still wouldn't pay him or let him go. So you can understand why at a certain point he wanted to take control of his career. It's great for him, and he seems happy that he's in LAFC, and why wouldn't he be happy? Because they are seemingly on a course to be one of the better teams in MLS history, and maybe even will win the Cup this year. It's just too bad that he got booed. I mean, he put in several really good seasons for the Revs. He was the guy and there wasn't a ton around him. And he, in those moments, didn't really complain about it publicly. I think I also have a problem with these with a hypothetical fan who was for the past several years complaining about the Kraft's lack of investment in the team, not doing a new stadium, not paying much for DPs, not putting a great, the best roster they could on the field, or were upset with Mike Burns, or even upset with Jay Heaps and Brad Friedel, and had those opinions, but at the same time also think that Lee Nguyen shouldn't have had those same opinions himself and wanted to get out of town like it seemed like half the roster did. You saw what Kellen Rose said, and there's a pretty decent number of guys who it seemed wanted to leave this organization in the past couple of years, and also you don't see guys flocking to come to the Revs, and maybe that'll change with Bruce Arena. But on the whole, I think Lee Nguyen had a pretty reasonable case, and I don't think he should have been booed like that.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I'll say, honestly, I don't care if the fans want to boo him, the fans can boo him because the fans can do whatever they want. And then they pay the money to be there. They can do their own thing. I think my bigger issue is, and I get that this obviously is associated with the idea of booing, but I think that people kind of forgot all the contributions that Lee Nguyen made. And I think that people also forget that in MLS, there's no real movement that can happen. I mean, if you think about it, in 2018, yes, he signed a contract in 2016, but in 2018, he was looking for a move. He had asked multiple times for a move, and the organization wasn't willing to budge. He even said that last night we were talking to him. He said, Mike Burns was not willing to budge. I was trying to force a move, try to be reasonable in a lot of different ways, but he wasn't willing to budge, so I had to make my stance to try to get a move. We've seen other organizations willing to move on from players. I'm just going to use Justin Meram, which is probably not a great example because he ends up going back to Columbus. But Justin Meram wants to move, and Columbus Crew say, you know what? We will move you. Okay? We move you to Orlando City. He goes there for a little while, doesn't like it. He comes back to Columbus. That might actually be a good example where people, if you treat some of these players with respect and understanding, they're going to speak highly of your organization. They're going to want to come back. And we haven't really seen that with the Revs. I mean, you think about Michael Parkhurst. He leaves. He has no interest in ever coming back to New England. He says he wants to retire in Atlanta. And that's a guy who's from the New England area, that once played for his hometown team, played multiple good years, but says, you know what, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back there with the turf. I don't really want to go back there with some of the organization that was there. Now, obviously, things might change because Bruce Arena is there. But, him, Jeff Laurentowicz, there have been so many different players that have left this organization on kind of bad terms because the organization was playing hardball. They weren't paying their players enough. They weren't listening to trade requests. In a lot of ways, they were kind of holding them hostage, and that's difficult to have positive feelings in that situation. If you're Lee Nguyen, yes, you signed a contract in 2016. That's a big step up from your initial contract. I went back and looked at the numbers, and he was making around like $44,000 when he first came to the Revs in 2012. That's pretty crazy to think about. The next year, he gets a salary bump to $73,000. So he has to and those numbers were roughly. I don't have the numbers exactly in front of me right now because I was also looking up some other information. But that's roughly what he was making. And yes, he's getting incremental salary bumps, but he's getting nothing when compared to players around the league that are putting up similar numbers, or even players on his own team that aren't putting up similar numbers. I mean, think about it. You're on this team where they're bringing in a guy like Claude Dielna on a big contract, and he's not proving to be much of a defender that's securing that back line. How are you supposed to feel as Lee Nguyen, this guy who's constantly putting up good numbers, constantly running the attack, and you're not getting paid as much as this guy who just comes from Europe and has a pedigree but isn't necessarily doing the job on your team? And there becomes a point where you get frustrated and you say, okay, if you're not going to trade me, if you're not going to give me that big contract, in a lot of ways, that was going to be his last payday, right? I mean, he's pretty old at this point. He deserves one last kind of big payday to show that he can continue to, partly because of all the things that he's done, but also because he's still a solid contributor for this team. So if they're not going to be willing to do that, then he has to do something in order to kind of pursue that last trophy or to try to pursue that last payday. So he decides not to show up. And I think, again, to me, it's the limitations of the organization. Mike Burns, I've heard it from multiple people saying that, we don't want to do business with him. That business was closed when Mike Burns was there. Someone actually texted me, an agent texted me, that it feels good that they're now going to be able to do business with the Revolution now that Mike Burns is gone. I mean, there's agents that didn't want to deal with this organization because of how they negotiate things. And I do think there is some benefits to that because, you're obviously able to get what you want. You're able to keep your salaries low. But there's some negatives there where there are going to be players that don't want to play for this organization. Kudos to Mike Burns in some ways for getting all those years out of Lee Nguyen for a very low salary. Think about Giassi Zardes. Giassi Zardes, is doing some good stuff, and all of a sudden gets this big contract this year, right? Is he worth that money? I don't know, maybe. But, the organization felt that they wanted to pay him that way to keep him there, to keep him happy, to keep him to continue scoring goals and not become a negative in the locker room and stuff like that. So they give him that money. In the case of Lee Nguyen, the argument was, well, you signed a contract in 2016. You better honor your contract, which I understand it's a valid thing. I mean, if anyone that has a contract needs to honor that contract. But there's also the situation of like, hey, look at everyone around me making more money that's doing less than me. Dude, don't you like value me? Don't you respect who I am? Like, you should give me a little bit more money. You should give me a little bit of promotion, or you should be willing to trade me somewhere else that that has a chance at winning a trophy. Remember, this is when Brad Friedel came in. Sure enough, like, we didn't really know how that was going to pan out, but like, the team wasn't in a good position, whether it was the end of the Jay Hughes era or the beginning of the Brad Friedel era. Things weren't going well. And for Lee Nguyen, you can understand that desire to go somewhere else. You could also, if you want to put it in more real life context, think about the situation where you're constantly in your job, you're working long hours, you go to your boss and ask for a promotion. He says, you're doing fine where you are right now. Like, why would we give you more money right now? It becomes that frustration. So I can understand why Lee Nguyen did what he did. And I kind of blame a little bit the MLS structure for allowing that to happen, where Lee Nguyen wanted to stay in MLS. Like, yes, there was interest elsewhere, but he came here for a reason. He likes living in this country, so he wanted to stay in this league. But there was no ability for him to gain free agency or to move unless Mike Burns was able to budge. And Mike Burns is not going to be able to wanting to budge because he's trying to keep that salary cap low. He's trying to keep players there because we know how hard it was for Revs to replace players. I mean, think about it. Lee Nguyen, if he leaves, yes, Carlos Heel came in, but it's going to be difficult for the Revs to replace that player. Think about how many players the Revs, especially before Bruce Arena, how many players the Revs picked up when they were young and they kept them year after year after year after year. That's kind of the structure of MLS. Like, you have to sign a lot of these contracts because there is no free agency, and it's difficult to kind of force a type of move unless the organization is willing to do it, like we saw with Justin Meram and some other players, or you gain that free agency, which we've seen is basically impossible until under the current CBA. So go ahead and boo him if you want to boo him, but there's also this understanding of, like, he was in a hard situation. You know, if your boss said, I'm not going to pay you more money, I'm not going to send you somewhere else, you'd have a similar situation. You'd eventually quit. You would eventually threaten to go somewhere else. And that's what Lee Nguyen did. He ends up forcing a move to LAFC. I personally think that if he was on another team, like right now he's a off the bench player, but if he was on another team, he would still be a starter in this league. I mean, when he comes off the bench, he is still so dynamic. He is still so creative. I think elsewhere in the league, he's still a starter. So, you know, like a couple years at a $750,000, maybe somewhere around that number is probably a fair contract for a guy who, when he began his time in MLS, was making around $40,000.
Yeah, and I just kind of want to point out a couple things and emphasize a few things, is that I think we kind of view athletes, you know, the contract argument, you know, I think that argument works a lot better for, say, baseball or, you know, football, where they're making millions and millions of dollars. You know, Seth, you mentioned that Lee Nguyen made $44,000 in 2012. I mean, there is very restricted free agency. There are, you know, the rules for MLS is really anti-player. It's very, very difficult for, especially American-based players who are coming up through the system domestically to get huge paydays. I know we've talked about how little draft picks are paid. I think Matt Turner is making $63,000 or something like that. When, you know, we talk about Diego Fagundes, who is second all-time on the Revolution goal-scoring list. He is still below $200,000. And so, you know, drastic actions are needed to get paid, to be paid fairly. And Lee Nguyen did have a bit of a contract dispute, I think in 2014 or 2015, when he was being paid, I think, like $140,000 during his MVP season, and the Revs rewarded him with a new contract. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, where when Lee Nguyen is the seventh highest paid player on the team, and they're sending a dump trunk of money to Claude Dielna's house, I understand why Lee Nguyen feels it a bit disrespectful. And I think it should be noted also that Lee Nguyen requested a trade multiple times in 2017. I think it needs to be known that Lee Nguyen had a bid from an Israeli team for $1 million in 2017 that the Revs passed on. They could have accepted that deal. That team was not going very far, and they decided to hold him throughout the rest of the season, which was fine logic at the time. But if you have an unhappy player who's requesting a trade and you get offered $1 million for him, that might be a situation where you want to pass up. That might be an offer you don't pass up. And then also the Revs got multiple offers before the 2018 season. As Taylor Twellman reported, I think a few teams, I think Chicago was a rumored team, Montreal was a rumored team, and the Revs didn't take it because it was an Eastern Conference team. So the Revs really were extremely picky on what to do with Lee Nguyen. And, it's you gain that reputation of being a team that restricts your players' careers and restricts them from moving forward. And as you said, that hurts the team in the long run. You mentioned Brian O'Connell's report on Lee Nguyen in 2018. He also reported that it had effects in the locker room, and a lot of the veteran players that were friends with Lee Nguyen and that had been playing with Lee Nguyen for years, it kind of divided the locker room and how the team felt about Brad Friedel and Mike Burns and how they were handling that situation. So overall, I mean, that I think is more criticisms of the Revs front office. If you want to boo Lee Nguyen for sitting out and not honoring his contract, that's fine. But I think you have to also understand that Lee Nguyen didn't sit out immediately. He didn't wake up one day in 2017 and request a trade and say, "I'm not playing until you trade me." He was playing through these trade requests. They gave him a full off season, and nothing happened. And so, I think that's just kind of the structure of MLS, where if you want to move to a different team, whether it's an MLS or abroad, you kind of have to force at least the Revolution's hand. And I will also bring up one other situation that just to kind of, again, crap on the front office for. For those of you that remember Steve Newman, he was cited in a Washington Post article where he requested his release, or he requested to be traded when he was not getting minutes, and the Revs denied it. Steve Newman wasn't playing at all, and essentially Steve Newman had to retire, and because the Revs had all of his rights. And so the Revs had a reputation for preventing players from moving on in their careers and moving to the highest possible level, which, in soccer, teams have to have that bit of an understanding that players are eventually going to want to move on, and you have to kind of work with them for that, or else it's going to bite you in the long run. And that's exactly what happened with Mike Burns. And as you say, Seth, that agent who says it's good to be able to do business with New England. Mike Burns certainly was not a very personal or nice player to his players. So, again, if you want to boo Lee Nguyen, that's fine, but I think he contributed a lot more, and his contributions to the Revs greatly outweigh kind of the ending in New England. So we did do a quick poll on if you would have booed Lee Nguyen if you were there, or cheered Lee Nguyen. 45% said they would have cheered Lee Nguyen, 31% that said they had no reaction, and 25% said they booed or they would have booed. So I think overall most of Revs fans are with us, but as I say, I think kind of the situation of the game where it was kind of ending, it was pretty apparent that the Revs were going to lose. I think it was a bit of a sour crowd that led to the boos coming in when he came in. Let's move on to some final thoughts. Carl, you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, and just a small point to draw back to what I was saying about that Lee Nguyen has had one of the more unfortunate careers for how great of a player he's been. That he's, I don't know where you would rank him on the list, but in the past decade or whatever, he's been one of the top number 10s among the American players, and if he was able to finally get that MLS Cup this year or next or whenever it may be, that it would feel kind of justified, that after having spent most of his career, just playing really well but not having the best opportunities that he might deserve. or hope for that he finally gets that chance toward the end of his career. But my overall last point is that I was just thinking about this Lee Nguyen situation of him coming back. Really puts in perspective the contrast, just the kind of culture and the reputation that the Revs had previously under. Maybe you want to put most of it on Mike Burns, or if you want to say that the Crafts only gave Mike Burns and the team so much, not enough resources to really do the job, or even some people have blamed Jay Heaps, which I don't. I think Jay Heaps was fine. Obviously, Brad Friedel was a mess, but it really draws into contrast that. Just recently, Bruce Arena, Gustavo Bo said he was kind of sold on the Revs by the chance to play for Bruce Arena and execute this vision that Bruce Arena had for him and for the team, and to be able, right after the Revs have always, of course, they brought in Carlos Heel in the offseason. That was a big move for them. But I think that Heel was looking for a place where he could kind of show himself after being down in the Segunda division in Spain, but to show right after he comes and takes over the Revs that he can attract a big kind of star player like that, and that just the change in the how players on the team seem to feel that it really is such a drastic change from the past few years, where you really can understand why Lee Nguyen felt like after years it was just time to move on, why Kellen Rowe seemed to have a similar sentiment, why we wondered if Diego Fagundes was headed for the exit. As you mentioned, how underpaid he's been, and didn't have a great season under Brad Friedel. Neither did Christian Pania. You wondered if maybe he kind of felt like it was his time here. He was ready maybe for the next stop, and Bruce Arena really changed all of that. And like I said, still obviously really early in his tenure, but it's a really positive sign, and it shows you how important team leadership, just in terms of the coach and the people running the operations, how big an impact that can have. And obviously Bruce Arena is one of the best that's ever done it in MLS, or most successful, and you're seeing why.
And Seth, do you have any final thoughts before we want to wrap this up?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple quick things, just because I know we're probably almost 2 hours long with this podcast. But just to give you a couple numbers, Jesse Zardes last year was making $630,000. This year he got a bump to $23 million. About $2 million as far as his salary bump. So that's, playing for a player that you want to be happy in Columbus. And just kind of also a fun little thing to look at is look at the salary numbers. When Lee Nguyen signed in 2012, he was making $44,000. Players that were making more than him are signing the Aussie at $84,000, Kellen Rowe at $75,000, Dimitri Mbongo at $70,000, Clyde Sims at $75,000, Tyler Pollock, if you remember that name, at $60,000, Stephen McCarthy at $51,000. Bobby Shuttleworth was actually making the same amount. Actually, he was making $101 more than Lee Nguyen. So just give you an idea of like Lee Nguyen came here. I know he came off the waiver transfer as far as coming from Vancouver, because Vancouver dumped him, but like he came here making absolutely nothing, like compared to the players on his team, compared to just in general what the salary was. And he slowly got these pay raises, but he never got that big payday like someone like Giasse Zardes got. So I mean, I think it's okay to feel for him. Like you said, like soccer players don't have long careers. They don't make much money unless they really demand it. And in this case, he had to demand it to do something. And I mean, I think he is thrilled to have been sent to LAFC, where he, played a decent amount of games this year, and even as a reserve, he's played a decent amount of games last year, and even this year, he's a little bit of a reserve. I think he's more than happy to kind of have that and be a playoff contender, to be a championship contender, to have a chance at the Supporters' Shield. I mean, I just can't imagine if he ends up staying all throughout last year with Brad Friedel running these two-a-days. The team goes through this horrible stretch. I remember, after Brad Friedel left, some players basically saying, I didn't think I could survive because we were, being out, we were overrun, they were exhausting us. And just imagine Lee Nguyen having to be living through that, making his mediocre salary, saying, I asked for a trade, guys. I wanted a trade. Please honor that situation. So I think that he found himself in a good situation. The Revs got a decent, haul for a guy who's, towards the end of his career. It's questionable for a player to sit out, especially if you're, a Revs fan. I can understand why you're frustrated, but it's what was best for the player, and I think that he has no regrets concerning it.
Yep, and for final thoughts on my end, I'm actually going to switch it up and talk about another former Rev, Kai Kamara. I don't know if this has ever happened in MLS history, but Kai scored an own goal and then responded with a hat trick. So a bit of an eventful night for Kai, where he found a goal 4 times last night, 3 of them for his own team. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Kai. Guys, you want to give your Twitter handles before we wrap it up? Seth, let's start with you.
At SethMan31.
I am also at SethMan31.
Any good articles coming from you guys this week? Anything you want to promote before we end it?
Yeah, couple days I should have a Lee Nguyen story up about why he doesn't owe the Revs anything.
So you can follow both Seth and Carl at SethMan31, and you can follow us at Revolution Recap, and also like our Revolution Recap page on Facebook. Please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. The Revs head to the West Coast next week for a brutal fixture against Seattle at CenturyLink Field, where they have not won since 2009. We'll be back next week to break it all down, but until then, thank you everyone for listening, and go Revs.